Pues como último, en Delmas Tsafack, del Muntu Institute de Camerún, que se ha trasladado del panel de Macías y va a ser en inglés. Y si hay para las preguntas, les puedo traducir cosas por si acaso. Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. Good evening, everyone. I will first of all begin by thanking the organizers for have invited me to this scientific event on the 50 years of independence of Equatorial Guinea. The topic I've chosen to work on is entitled Protector or Tormentor, the changing dynamics of state violence in post-colonial Equatorial Guinea. Since its independence in 1968, Equatorial Guinea has been ruled under the dictatorial regime of Mathias Nguema, elected democratically as first president of Equatorial Guinea. Mathias Nguema quickly turned into a dictator. According to Suzanne Cronje, violence and repression have a long history in Equatorial Guinea, owing much to the nature of Spanish colonial rule. But since independence in 1968, and especially when President Macias started increasing personal power in 1970, legalized oppression and political murder have become commonplace instruments of government's policy. A number of researchers have written on dictatorship and repression in Equatorial Guinea since 1968. Max Linigué-Gumaz, arguably the most prominent author on Equatorial Guinea, has extensively published on the history of Equatorial Guinea. He explains in his various publications what he characterizes as Nguemism. According to him, the Nguemism is characterized by nepotism, racism, terror, torture, rapes, suicides, village burning, privatization of fundamental liberties, manipulation of parliament and the constitution. Given the persuasive nature of violence in the past and present of Equatorial Guinea, it has become an inevitable theme in most of the scholarship of this country. So, within the wide range of social science disciplines, scholars such as Max Linigué-Gumaz, I've already quoted him, Alejandro Artucio, Alejandra Majique Nunes, Cynthia Cadet, Marion Mesh Yameli, and myself have focused on the dictatorial regime of Mathias Nguema. However, few of these works have addressed the central question of state violence in a systematic and sustained deep manner. Despite the growing and excellent work being produced on the dictatorship of Mathias Nguema, much remains to be said on the causes and the manifestations and the extent of state violence in this country. In fact, the history of institutionalized violence, crime, and political oppression in Equatorial Guinea is yet to be written. This paper aims to investigate political violence and crime perpetrated on the population of Equatorial Guinea by state actors from 1968 to date. This study seeks to answer the following questions. Why and how has the government institutionalized violence and crime in Equatorial Guinea since the independence of this country? What role has the military played in perpetrating political violence and crime in Equatorial Guinea? Who were or who are people that were most persecuted by the Nguema's regime? This study is an outcome of a field research conducted in Equatorial Guinea and spent in 2017, that is last year, using mainly archival research. In addition to archival research, we use interviews, participant observation, and document analysis. Witnesses of the terror regime and former prisoners and relatives of Macias Nguema who are still alive were interviewed as part of the study. The paper is divided into two sections. The first section analyzes the causes of institutionalized violence and crime in Equatorial Guinea, and the second presents the instruments of violence and crime in a post-colonial Equatorial Guinea. But I will focus my speech on the first part, on the causes of institutionalized violence. Let us enshrine the violence in Equatorial Guinea into a theoretical framework. The theoretical framework which can be used to explain the state terror in Equatorial Guinea is the power conflict theory. According to this theory, terror results from strength of the state and the massive and ever-increasing concentration of power in the hands of national and international elites. Terror states do not emerge because violence is necessary, but rather because elites choose to rely on it, believing that it is a rational and cost-effective means to achieve their political-economic needs, namely to preserve and advance their privilege within the system of social stratification. Terror is here conceived as primarily a strategy or a weapon exploited in a system of concentrated power. Elites who resort to terror do not do it because the state is weak, but rather because they are strong and can get away with it. I'm here quoting Sluka. This theory seems to explain the case of Equatorial Guinean state terror. Since independence, Macias and Obiang used terror as mode of rule in a bid to preserve their power. In fact, the military and paramilitary forces seems to exist for this reason only. Let us see now the roots of state violence in Equatorial Guinea. Institutionalized violence and crime in Equatorial Guinea are the outcome of decades of long personalized rule by executive Equatorial Guinean presidents, but also of neo-colonialism. Violence under the Macias regime was inspired by colonial violence, as well as Macias' admiration for what Hitler has done to the world. The failed coup of March 1969 can be considered as the tipping point of state terror in this country since 1968. Here in my study from the document I found, I tried to qualify Macias Nguema as an African Franco inspired by Hitler. Why? Post-colonial states preserve colonial structures of violence and repression. According to some analysis, the post-colonial state is merely an extension of the colonial state, albeit an exogenous one, and the state itself becomes a hindrance to democracy and democracy's development by having democracy become associated with authoritarianism. Macias Nguema's institutional violence was also a continuity of colonial violence. Colonial masters trampled the human rights of Equatorial Guinea, the human rights of Equatorial Guineans. Colonial repression also forced into exile anti-colonial activists in neighboring countries. Spanish colonial administration sent agents in countries where anti-colonial activists took refuge. They were ordered to assassinate nationalists. This was the case of Acacio Manye Ela and Enrique Okenve, who were arrested by colonial guards and killed in detention. One of the missions of the Spanish civil guard in Equatorial Guinea was to find those who were asking independence and kill them, even if they were in exile. Macias used the same strategy to kill his opponents when he took over the power. He has been inspired by the brutality of the Spanish colonial administration and the dictatorship of Francisco Franco. Macias admires I admired Francisco Franco and publicly called him my colleague and my homonym. For very early on, he banned rights recognized by the law, arguing that in Franco's Spain, this did not exist either. So Franco here is like a model for Macias Nguema. He even threatened to shoot his enemies, arguing to shoot his enemies just as Franco had done with his pupil. He proclaimed himself follower of the 30 years of peace of the Generalissimo, which they celebrated in 1969. Macias Nguema, just at his arrival at the power, copied the behavior of the colonial government. And the dictatorial structure of Francoism were used by Macias to rule over Equatorial Guinea. As I've said, Hitler was also seen by Macias Nguema as the man who saved Africa and whose ideology has to be followed and implemented. In many of his official speeches, he told his people that Hitler was the man who saved Africa. For example, on January 16, 1969, he gathered Guineans and Spanish officials at the Malabo Stadium and delivered a speech. According to Macias, I quote, "The man who made Africa's independence possible was Hitler. By provoking the war in Europe, he succeeded in bringing the freedom we enjoy today. Although they say that Hitler was bad, in fact, they were wrong. Hitler tried to save Africa, where he had to fight, but then began to annex to the European countries. That is the man who has given us freedom. Keep this in mind, because without the war, Africa would not have been anything. I read the story and review everything, and I mediate. Many talk badly about Hitler, but do not know that without World War II, Africa would not have been free. Because in the war, Africans learned what freedom was when they saw the massacre being violated by whites, and people started applauding. And they saw that if they were killed for their freedom, why Africans are not going to demand freedom from the colonial powers? That is why I say that Hitler has been the promoter of freedom in Africa. Let it be, for no one can deceive you anyone. End of quote. What I'm reading here is what is written. If you look at Ebano, the government newspaper at that time, this is written in the speech Macias gave that day. You can find it at the Archivo General de la Administración Alcalá de Henares. All these speeches of Macias Nguema are a sign that his reign was not to be peaceful with Spanish. It is also one of the indicators that a dictatorial regime had just been instituted in Equatorial Guinea. We can thus consider that the institutionalized violence in Equatorial Guinea can be explained by Macias' will to perpetuate the colonial violence of Spanish colonial masters, and also the will to take Hitler as a model of governance. What is not good? The real motivation of arrest and assassination was to intimidate his people, to install a climate of fear within the population, so they will obey him. In an end of mission report, Fournier, a former French ambassador in Equatorial Guinea, pointed that Macias was irascible, mistrustful, and paranoid, and was looking for all means to keep his absolute power. It is one of the motivations of institutionalized violence in Equatorial Guinea. In the months that followed the election of Macias, he was confronted to a coup that changed his mind and deepened his dictatorial behavior. Let us look at the failed coup and the troubled role of Spain in the institutionalization of violence, of state violence in Equatorial Guinea. The ideal of the young Republic of Equatorial Guinea to accede to independence on October 12, 1968 was to create a state of law with all of its consequences, in which the individual and collective freedom in accordance with the laws that governs every free state, which established respect for human rights, promote their homeland to achieve a level of development that allows its inhabitants to live a safe, secure, and prosperous life, free from any restlessness that did not conform to the achievements of these purposes. This was stated in the first constitution of the country. Equatorial Guinea, though, through its political representative, had drawn up a joint action program which was handed over to Matthias Ngema, hence his slogan at the electoral campaign, "A man, a team, and a program." At that time, he could rouse his audience. All his speeches started with the slogan, "Unity, peace, and prosperity." And here I underline peace, because at this time he was talking about peace. He was a nationalist for many Equatorial Guineans at the electoral phase. While discussing with people before the election, he will always finish his regularly long speech by pointing a plantation or a house that belonged to a white and asking them, "Do you need this?" And the people answered, "Yes." And then he said, "If you want this, you should vote for me." Here I'm quoting Kindleberg. This explained how Matthias Ngema was going to be opposed to Spanish after the independence of Equatorial Guinea. And even the Catholic Church presented Matthias as the real person at the real place. The Catholic magazine that you may know, La Guinea Equatorial, created in 1903, published a special issue in 1968 when the government of the new government of independent Equatorial Guinea was formed by Matthias. In this issue, they considered him as a hero who was motivated by a single idea, the independence of his people. They continued by saying that Matthias passed all his life at the service of his people. According to Catholics, Matthias was a man who gained the sympathy and confidence of his people to lead by trials of people of order, of justice and progress. You can find it on the issue of La Guinea Equatorial of 1968, just after the elections. Matthias was seen by some Spanish as the best person to provide over the destiny of Equatorial Guinea. It is the case of his mentor, Antonio Garcia Trevijano, who said that at the time of independence, the only person with the necessary force of character, strength, energy, and pride was Matthias. He was the only leader capable of uniting the country behind him. But few months after the independence, Matthias, who was seen as a very good president, turned into dictatorship. The causes of this change can be found in the failed coup and the troubled role of Spain in this putsch. At the independence of Equatorial Guinea, Spain promised to maintain a special relationship by coming to his aid in all areas. The Spanish-Guinean relationship were based on a mission statement signed on June 22nd, 1968, 4 months before the proclamation of the independence. Spain recognized the sovereignty of Equatorial Guinea and assured its assistance in preserving its independence and guaranteeing the convertibility of Equatorial Guinean currency to cover expenses related to the transition period. Here is a quote from Liniger Gumas. Spain, in fact, sought to preserve its influence in the Gulf of Guinea. According to Max Liniger Gumas, Spain imagined an Equatorial Guinea organized around Madrid's interest in order to perpetuate the system of autonomy established in 1964. Spain had not kept its promise to fund the budget. The Spanish refusal to fund the budget provoked a series of crises between the two countries. You all know that. And at the independence of Equatorial Guinea, Spanish said they will continue to support financially. But just a few months after, salaries of civil servants were not paid, as stated in the convention with Madrid. According to Equatorial Guineans, Madrid didn't pay it to increase anger in Equatorial Guinea, so it will create uprisings in the countries, and Macias will be replaced by their fellow, Atanasio Ndongo Mione. For this, this is an information I got from one Equatorial Guinea living in Madrid. Spanish had chosen Atanasio as their preferred candidate, but unfortunately the man failed at the elections phase. So you know the political crisis between Equatorial Guinea and Spain created a crisis. Created a real crisis between the two countries. And when we had the coup in Equatorial Guinea, Macias suspected Spain to have tell Atanasio to do that, and it is one of the things that pushed Macias to institutionalize violence by changing everything in Equatorial Guinea and creating a dictatorial regime. So the other causes of equatorial state violence in Equatorial Guinea is the overconfidence of presidents to their kingship. If we take the example of Macias, Macias, when he was president, the man who was to replace Macias when Macias is not in the country was Buzio, Edmundo Buzio. But each time Macias were out, he was not the person replacing him, but Obiangema, who is his nephew. And in one of my discussion with my informants, they said Ondo Edu was killed when Macias was doing a tour in the country, and when Macias, he was in Minkomesen, and it is when he was in Minkomesen that he heard that Ondo Edu has been killed, and he was surprised. He didn't know why he was killed, but since he was the president, it is why people said he's the one who killed him. But the real person who killed him was not Macias, according to the information that I had. So you can multiply so many examples like that. That the president had overconfidence to his kingship, and they betrayed him. We can see in 1979 when we had the putsch against himself. The push came from his nephew in quotes, because some people said that he's not his real nephew, but they belong to the same ethnic group. So these are some examples, some causes of institutionalized violence that I've gathered during my my research. And the last thing is the problem of education, because many people said Macias had a problem with education. He tried to be a civil servant and he failed, I think, 3 times. It is at the last time at a receipt session that he passed. And he had so many problems with intellectuals, and saying that intellectuals are those people who are bringing trouble in the country. That is the problem. And when you interview so many Equatorial Guineans, they will say one of the problems of Equatorial Guinea, talking of violence, is the problem of education of the president. The president doesn't have. The president has few knowledge. It is why he is persecuting all those who are reflecting against what who do not accept his opinions. This is one side, and even today we can see this on the education system of the country. Okay. Since Macias decided to close so many schools in Equatorial Guinea. It is in the 1990s that they think to create a university. Until now, we have the consequences of the lack of education in that country, where the education system is not strong. And when you investigate, you see that a huge percentage of intellectuals of Equatorial Guinea are living abroad. That is a problem in the country. So I can stop here and say thank you for your understanding. Thank you very much.
Thank you.